When you think of Easter, what comes to mind? I bet it's pastel colors, maybe some family gatherings, hunting for colorful eggs, all the fun stuff. It's one of the biggest holidays of the year, all centered on the resurrection of Jesus Christ. But have you ever really stopped and thought about all the other traditions, the ones that aren't about the resurrection?
I mean, seriously, the eggs, the Easter bunny, even the name Easter, where did all that actually come from? Because while the resurrection is, of course, a huge part of the Bible, you won't find a single mention of bunnies or decorated eggs in there. The source material we're digging into today makes a fascinating case that these traditions are way, way older than most of us think, with a story that starts somewhere totally unexpected. So, where do we even begin to unravel this? Well, the first clue is hiding in plain sight. It's the name of the holiday itself. The word Easter seems so normal to us, but according to this source, that single word is the first major key to unlocking a hidden story.
Okay, now take a look at this. It's kind of mind-blowing when you see it laid out. In most of the world, in most other languages, the word for the holiday comes directly from Pesach. That's the Hebrew word for Passover. You see it right there. Pascua in Spanish, Pax in French. It all points back to the biblical Passover. But then, look at English. Our word, Easter, is the odd one out. It comes from Yonstre, the name of an old Anglo-Saxon goddess of spring and the dawn.
And look, this isn't some wild new theory. Historians have known about this for a long time. This quote from the American Book of Days says it pretty clearly. The early church had a habit of taking old pagan customs and, well, giving them a Christian makeover. It makes sense, right? A festival celebrating a goddess of spring and rebirth? That's a pretty easy fit for a celebration of resurrection. So the name itself is our first thread.
But the name is really just the tip of the iceberg. According to the source, if you want to find the real origin of the eggs and the Easter bunny, the evidence trail takes you much, much further back in time. We're talking all the way back to ancient Babylon.
And check this out. You can actually trace the journey of this goddess through different cultures. The source says it all starts with Ishtar in Babylon. She was part of a myth about the god Tammuz dying and being resurrected, which brought spring back to the world. Sound familiar? That same goddess was called Astarte by the Phoenicians, Ashtaroth in the Hebrew Bible, and eventually Eostre by the Anglo-Saxons. So the argument is that even though the names changed, the core idea, death, resurrection, fertility, spring, it all stayed the same, stretching right up to the name of our holiday today.
Now get this. The trail even leads us to a really stunning passage right from the Bible. In the book of Ezekiel, God is showing the prophet these pagan rituals that are happening right inside his own temple. You have women weeping for Tammuz, that resurrected god from Babylon, and men in the temple turning their backs on God to worship the rising sun in the east. And God's reaction is intense. He calls these things greater abominations. This is a huge point for the source we're looking at because it draws a straight line from this ancient sun worship at dawn straight to the modern tradition of an Easter sunrise service.
So let's keep going with the symbols. The egg? It wasn't just a fun craft. In Babylon, it was a massive symbol of rebirth. The hare, or the bunny, that was the sacred animal for the goddess Eastre, a powerful symbol of fertility. The source even claims that hot cross buns started out as cakes that pagans offered to the Queen of Heaven. So the argument is that every single one of these iconic symbols has a pre-Christian history.
All right, so if these traditions come from paganism, the big question is why? Why on earth did they get wrapped up in mainstream Christianity? Well, according to this source, the answer isn't about theology at all. It's about politics.
The argument goes like this. In the early centuries of the church, the Roman Empire was incredibly anti-Jewish, and the early church wanted to create as much distance as possible from its Jewish roots. So, what better way to do that than to ditch the Jewish Passover and replace it with a popular Roman festival that already happened around the same time of year? It was a strategic political move.
And this whole shift was basically made official at the famous Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. The Roman Emperor Constantine, who, by the way, was a sun worshipper, used this council to standardize Easter across the entire empire, formally cutting the tie between the celebration of the resurrection and the Jewish Passover it was originally connected to.
Okay, so we've talked about the history, but now let's get into the core theological case the source makes. Beyond all the historical evidence, it argues that the Bible itself warns against doing this exact kind of thing, this mixing of beliefs. The case is built on scriptures just like these, and the point being made is really specific. It's not just don't worship other gods, it's learn not the way of the heathen. The argument is that God isn't just rejecting false gods, he's also rejecting the methods and rituals of pagan worship.
You know, the perfect example of this is the story of the golden calf. Think about it. Aaron didn't say, "Hey everyone, here's a new god." No, he built a pagan idol and then declared, "Tomorrow is a feast to the Lord." They were trying to worship the right God, but they were doing it the wrong way, the Egyptian way, and the result was a disaster. The source uses this to say that how we worship matters just as much as who we worship.
Then there's what the source calls the sign of Jonah problem. And honestly, it's just simple math. Jesus himself said the only sign he would give was that he'd be in the tomb for 3 days and 3 nights. That's 72 hours. But the traditional timeline, a Good Friday crucifixion to a Sunday morning resurrection, that's only about 36 hours. It just doesn't add up.
And on top of that, the source argues that God didn't just leave the resurrection without its own special day. The Bible already had a festival called the Feast of First Fruits. It falls on the Sunday right after Passover, and the New Testament actually points to it as the exact day Christ rose, becoming the first fruits from the dead. The argument is that Easter wasn't a necessary addition, it was a replacement for something that was already there.
All right, let's wrap all this up. When you boil it all down, the entire case that this source material presents rests on 4 big pillars.
First, there's the history, the idea that the name Easter and its symbols are all pagan. Second is the command, that the Bible explicitly says not to mix pagan traditions into your worship. Third is the alternative, that God already had a special day picked out, the Feast of First Fruits. And finally, Christ's words, that Jesus himself spoke out against this kind of mixture.
And so, this explainer doesn't really end with a neat conclusion. Instead, it ends with the exact question that the source poses to its readers. After tracing the name to a goddess, the symbols all the way back to Babylon, and the timing to a political decision, it leaves you with this final, provocative thought. Knowing all this history, why continue the tradition?